Imagine standing in a dense Pacific Northwest forest. The air smells of cedar and damp earth, and rising above the tree line, towering over 40 feet into the gray sky, is a carved wooden column covered in faces. Animal faces. Human faces. Creatures that don't seem to belong to either world. And the longer you look, the more unsettling it becomes. Because it feels less like an object, and more like something that is watching you back. Somewhere in the back of your mind, a question surfaces that you cannot shake. What exactly are they watching for? In 1863, a group of government officials arrived at a Haida village on the coast of British Columbia. They had orders, and those orders were not to negotiate. They were there to take. What they carried away that day were irreplaceable, centuries-old carved monuments that the Haida people had spent generations building. Those poles ended up in museums, behind glass, with little plaques that said nothing about what was actually stolen. That story is not the exception. It is the rule. And by the time this video is over, you will understand exactly why totem poles are one of the most misunderstood, most exploited, and most resilient art forms in North American history. Welcome to Frontier Uncensored. I am your host, Dustin, and today we are going into the real history of totem poles. Not the postcard tourist version, but the deeper story. If you are new here, hit subscribe. This channel does not do shallow. Let us get into it. To understand what a totem pole actually is, you first have to throw out a lot of bad assumptions. Most people grow up seeing them as decorative objects, theme park props, or museum pieces. That framing is the product of a deliberate effort to strip these structures of their meaning. A totem pole is not an idol. It is not a god. And it was never just art in the modern gallery sense. It is at its core a document, a carved, painted, vertical record of a family's lineage, spiritual alliances, social standing, and clan history. Every single figure on that pole is a word in a sentence. Every arrangement of those figures is a paragraph in a story, and that story belongs specifically to the family, clan, or community that commissioned it. In that sense, a totem pole is meant to be read. Even the word totem comes from the Ojibwe language. The root word is odudum, which translates to his kinship group or clan relationship. That idea, kinship, is at the center of everything. These poles were about belonging, ancestry, and the inherited ties between people, place, and the spiritual world. The nations most strongly associated with monumental pole carving are the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast, including the Haida, Tlingit, Kwakwaka'wakw, and the Coast Salish. These were sophisticated, settled civilizations with complex social hierarchies, deep trade networks, and powerful ceremonial systems. They lived in a world shaped by Western red cedar, massive, straight-grained, rot-resistant trees strong enough to become monument, house, canoe, and mask all at once. And here is something that almost never gets mentioned. These cultures had access to excellent iron long before sustained European contact, through trade networks moving down from Alaska and Siberia. So when Europeans arrived and congratulated themselves on introducing iron tools to the Northwest coast, they were arriving very late to a party that had already been going on for generations. But to truly understand the poles, you need to know that they did not stand alone. They were part of a larger ceremonial and legal world. You could not separate the carving from the community, or the image from the event that gave it authority. That is why the potlatch mattered so much. To outsiders, the potlatch was often dismissed as a feast or an extravagant gift-giving ceremony. In reality, it was far more than that. It was a system for confirming status, witnessing history, redistributing wealth, validating names, and renewing social order. And it was the exact setting in which poles were raised. You could not just carve a pole and stick it in the ground. The raising of a totem pole required a potlatch, because in a culture without written records, the community's collective memory was the legal record. Witnesses had to be present, and gifts had to be distributed to compensate those witnesses for their role in validating the historical claims encoded in the pole. Without that network, the pole was only wood. With it, the pole became history made public. That is why the ban on the potlatch was so destructive. When the Canadian government criminalized the ceremony in 1885 through amendments to the Indian Act, they did not just ban a party. They banned the entire operating system of Northwest Coast legal and cultural life. The stated goal was to accelerate assimilation by severing Indigenous peoples from their traditional institutions. The ban remained in effect until 1951. That is 66 years, more than 2 full generations. During that time, the consequences were catastrophic. Totem poles that had stood for generations were left to weather and collapse because the ceremonies needed to maintain and replace them were illegal. Government agents and missionaries physically removed poles from villages, sometimes burning them, and often selling them to museums across Canada, the United States, and Europe. The people doing this genuinely believed they were preserving artifacts that a dying culture would no longer need. The arrogance embedded in that assumption is staggering. They saved the cedar and ignored the people. They preserved the object, after helping destroy the world that made the object matter. But you can suppress a tradition. You cannot kill it because traditions live in people. Before we get to the modern revival, there is one specific kind of pole that completely changes how people think about Indigenous justice and political life: the shame pole. Yes, shame poles were real. In some traditions, they were raised to publicly call out a person, family, or institution that had acted dishonorably, failed to settle a debt, or broken an obligation. They typically featured an inverted figure, sometimes with a red face, representing the party being called out. Everyone knew what they meant. The point was not random humiliation. It was accountability. It turned reputation into public pressure. And what makes that tradition so sophisticated is that it contained a clear path to resolution. The shame pole came down when the debt was settled and the wrong was addressed. It was not a permanent punishment, but a public demand to restore balance and honor. Think this is just ancient history? In 2007, a Tlingit artist named Tommy Joseph erected a shame pole in Cordova, Alaska. The target was the chief executive officer of ExxonMobil. The Exxon Valdez oil spill had occurred in 1989, devastating Prince William Sound. Nearly 2 decades later, the communities that depended on that environment were still suffering, and the legal settlements had been reduced on appeal. The company had not made things right. So, the community carved a pole and put it up where everyone could see it, using a tool refined over centuries to hold power accountable through public art. Is there a modern equivalent that works as cleanly as that? Let me know in the comments what you think. Now let us look at what actually goes on these poles, because the visual language is extraordinarily rich and deliberate. The raven appears on more poles than almost any other figure. In Northwest Coast traditions, Raven is the trickster and the transformer. He is the being responsible for releasing the sun, moon, and stars from boxes where a powerful chief had hoarded them, bringing light to the world. Raven represents creativity, intelligence, and the power to reshape reality. Seeing a raven at the top of a clan pole is a proud statement of cosmological identity. The eagle sits at the opposite end of the social structure. Where raven is cunning and unpredictable, the eagle represents clarity, strength, vision, and authority. The bear can represent power, protection, and the strength of the maternal. The bear mother's story encodes a deep relationship with the natural world, reminding the family that the bear is not just an animal, but an ancestral relative. The killer whale speaks to the sea, family loyalty, and deep intelligence. Wolves represent fierce loyalty. Frogs, often found at the bottom of poles, are associated with communication between the seen and unseen worlds. Every single figure, its placement, and the direction it faces is intentional and meaningful. Another major form was the mortuary pole, which marked the transition between life and death. These poles held a carved box near the top, containing the remains of a high-status individual. The carvings would narrate that person's life, lineage, and spiritual journey. The craftsmanship was often the finest of any tradition, because the carver was creating a container for a soul in transition. One of the most significant mortuary poles in recent history is the Tanu pole in Haida, carved by master carver Christian White. The Tanu pole is a direct response to the losses of the colonial era, a reclamation proving that the knowledge and the obligation to honor the dead survived every attempt to extinguish it. When the Potlatch ban was finally lifted in 1951, the damage was severe, and institutional knowledge had been disrupted across generations. But a revival happened. In the 50s and 60s, a small number of elderly master carvers began the painstaking work of recovering the tradition. They studied old poles, interviewed elders, and crucially, they began teaching. Artists like Mungo Martin worked publicly to ensure the tradition would not die with him. Ellen Neal, one of the few women carvers recognized in the mid-20th century, carved smaller traditional poles as deliberate acts of cultural propagation. By the 70s, artists like the Haida carver Bill Reed brought these visual languages into the contemporary art world, demonstrating that these traditions were living languages capable of saying new things while honoring the old. Today, the movement is focused on repatriation, returning displaced Poles to their home territories. Repatriation is not just about property. It is about restoring relationship, authority, and memory. A powerful example involves the Haisla First Nation. For decades, a monumental pole from the Haisla village of Kitamat had stood in a museum in Gothenburg, Sweden. In 2006, after lengthy negotiations, the pole was finally repatriated. But the exchange was poetic. The Haisla carved an entirely new pole and sent it to Sweden to replace the old one in the museum, while they brought their original ancestor home. In 2017, the community went further, replacing an older pole in their own village with a new one designed entirely by community members. It was a declaration. We decide what represents us, and we decide what stands in our community. So when you stand in front of a totem pole today, the real question is not just what you are looking at. The real question is what is looking back. Because those faces are permanent witnesses to the ongoing life of the people who created them. They watched as communities raised them. They watched as outsiders misunderstood them and treated them as relics of a vanishing culture. They watched as governments tried to silence the ceremonies that gave them life. And now, they are watching the return of memory, the return of carving, and the return of the right to tell the story on indigenous terms. The wood remembers. The hands that shaped it are gone, but the shapes remain. And against every effort to make these traditions disappear, the people remembered too. Do you think the cultural repatriation movement has gone far enough? Or do museums still have a long way to go? I genuinely want to know where you stand, so drop it in the comments below. This has been Frontier Uncensored. I am Dustin.